heat rises. This is the single most important fact in the physics of keeping a house warm, and it is the fact that nearly every homesteader on the American frontier got wrong. They chinked their walls, they sealed their doors, they banked earth against their foundations and stuffed rags into every crack they could find, and they burned 5 cords of firewood every winter and still woke up shivering at 3 in the morning with frost on the inside of their windows, and the reason was above their heads the entire time. The ceiling. The thin barrier of rough-sawn planks between the living space and the underside of the roof, through which warm air passed as easily as smoke through a screen door. A log wall 6 inches thick has a thermal resistance that slows heat loss to a manageable rate. A plank ceiling 1 inch thick has almost none. The warm air generated by a fireplace burning hard wood at 1200 degrees rises to the highest point in the room, presses against that single inch of pine or spruce, and passes its heat directly through the wood and into the attic space above, where it meets the underside of the roof boards, transfers again, and escapes into the winter sky. The entire thermal output of the fireplace, every BTU generated by every stick of firewood, split and hauled and stacked and burned, rises upward and leaves the building through the ceiling faster than the fire can replace it. A cabin with well-chinked walls and an uninsulated ceiling loses between 40 and 60% of its heat through the roof. This is not an estimate. This is a measurable physical fact that can be demonstrated with a thermometer and 30 minutes of patience. Place one thermometer at floor level and another at ceiling level in an uninsulated frontier cabin with a fire burning in the hearth, and the difference will be between 15 and 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The air at the ceiling is significantly warmer than the air at the floor, and that warm air is in direct contact with the coldest surface in the building, and the heat transfers through that surface and is gone. Every hour, every day, every winter. The homesteader responds by burning more wood, and the additional heat rises and escapes through the same ceiling, and the cycle continues until either the wood runs out or spring arrives, whichever comes first. The solution is insulation, not wall insulation, which helps but addresses the smaller problem, but ceiling insulation, which addresses the larger one. And among all the natural insulating materials available on the 19th century frontier, straw, sawdust, wood shavings, cattail fluff, dried leaves, wool scraps, one material outperformed every other by a measurable margin, and it was the one that most American-born settlers would never have considered using because it looked like something that belonged in a swamp rather than in a house. Sphagnum moss, the soft, spongy, pale green moss that grows in thick mats across bogs and wetlands throughout the northern latitudes of both Europe and North America. Dried sphagnum moss has a thermal conductivity of approximately 0.04 watts per meter Kelvin. For comparison, dry sawdust, the most commonly used frontier ceiling insulation, has a thermal conductivity of approximately 0.08 watts per meter Kelvin. Straw is approximately 0.07. Wool is approximately 0.04, the same as moss, but wool was far too expensive to pack into a ceiling in 1887. Moss was free. It grew in every bog within walking distance of every settlement in Vermont, and it could be harvested by the cartload in a single afternoon, and when dried and packed 12 inches deep above a plank ceiling, it created an insulating barrier that cut heat loss through the roof by 85 to 90%. The difference between an uninsulated ceiling and a moss-insulated ceiling was the difference between burning 5 cords of firewood per winter and burning 2.5. The difference between waking up shivering and waking up warm. The difference between a house that fought the cold and a house that held the heat. Aldous Ozals knew this. He had known it since he was old enough to climb a ladder and help his father pack dried sphagnum into the ceiling cavity of their farmhouse outside Cesis, in the Vidzeme region of Latvia, where winter temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks at a time, and where every farmhouse that had survived more than a generation had the same feature. A thick layer of dried sphagnum moss packed between the ceiling boards and the roof boards, sometimes 12 inches deep, sometimes 18, maintained and replenished every few years as the moss slowly compressed under its own weight. The Latvians called it sunu siltināšana, moss insulation, and it was not a folk remedy or a peasant superstition. It was standard construction practice across the Baltic states, refined over centuries of trial and measurement in a climate that punished poor insulation with frostbite and firewood shortages and, occasionally, death. Every Latvian farmer knew that heat rises. Every Latvian farmer knew that the ceiling was the weakest point in the thermal envelope. And every Latvian farmer knew that dried sphagnum moss, packed tightly in the space above the ceiling, trapped more heat per inch than any other material they could harvest from the land for free. The Latvians understood something else about sphagnum moss that most cultures did not. They understood that moss is not just an insulator, it is a moisture regulator. The same cellular structure that traps air also absorbs and releases water vapor in response to changes in humidity. When the air inside a cabin is humid, from cooking, from breathing, from wet clothing hung to dry near the fire, the moss absorbs the excess moisture and holds it in its cells. When the air dries out, the moss releases the moisture back. This buffering effect prevents the condensation that destroys other insulating materials. Straw insulation in a ceiling cavity becomes damp from condensation within 2 winters and begins to rot. Sawdust compresses when damp and loses its insulating air pockets. Cattail fluff mats together into a flat, useless layer. Sphagnum moss absorbs the condensation, holds it temporarily, and releases it when conditions change. And during this entire cycle, it does not lose its loft, does not compress, and does not decay. A ceiling insulated with straw needs replacement every 3 to 5 years. A ceiling insulated with sphagnum moss needs only occasional replenishment. Adding a few inches on top every 7 to 10 years to compensate for the slow, inevitable compression that gravity causes in any fibrous material over time. The Latvian farmhouse where Aldous grew up had been insulated with sphagnum moss since before his grandfather was born, and the moss had been replenished twice in living memory, and the ceiling joists were as sound as the day they were hewn. Aldous arrived in Vermont in the spring of 1885, with Dana, his wife, and the clothes on their backs, and $47 in American currency folded inside a leather pouch that Dana had sewn into the lining of her coat. They had left Latvia because there was no future there for a man who wanted to own his own land. The Baltic provinces were controlled by German-speaking landlords who had held the estates for generations, and Latvian peasants worked the land as tenants, paying rent in grain and labor, and never building equity in anything. Aldous had been a timber framer and carpenter in Vidzeme, building and repairing farmhouses and barns using techniques his father had taught him and his father's father had taught before that, and he was good at it, and it would never make him anything more than a skilled laborer on someone else's land. America offered land. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres to anyone willing to live on it and improve it for 5 years, and Aldous had read about this in a Latvian language newspaper in Riga and had decided within a week that he and Dinah would go. They settled in the hill country of northeastern Vermont, near the town of Hardwick in Caledonia County, where a small cluster of homesteads had formed along a valley that ran between two ridges of spruce-covered hills. The land was rocky and steep and heavily forested, and the winters were brutal. Average January temperatures of 8 degrees Fahrenheit, with regular dips to 15 and 20 below, and snowfall that began in November and did not stop until April. The other settlers in the valley were a mix of Yankee families who had been there for a generation or two, and newer arrivals from Ireland and Quebec, and they had all built their cabins in roughly the same way. Hewn log walls, stone chimneys, plank floors or packed earth, and plank ceilings with nothing above them but the roof boards and the sky. Some had stuffed straw or sawdust into the attic space. Most had not bothered, because the conventional wisdom in Vermont in 1887 was that ceiling insulation was unnecessary if your walls were tight and your chimney drew well. The heat that escaped through the ceiling was considered an acceptable loss, the cost of having a roof over your head, and the solution to being cold was to burn more wood. Aldous built his cabin in the summer of 1885, and he built it differently. The walls were standard hewn logs, 8 inches through, chinked with a mixture of clay, lime, and chopped moss. The moss acting as a fiber binder that prevented the chinking from cracking as it dried, another Latvian technique that the neighbors noted but did not understand. The chimney was fieldstone and clay mortar, competent but unremarkable. The floor was packed earth, which Aldous planned to replace with planks when he could afford to have lumber milled. But the ceiling was where Aldous spent his time and his thought. He hewed the ceiling joists from spruce, 8 inches square, and set them on 16-inch centers, closer together than the standard 24 inches, which gave him a stronger ceiling, and more importantly, narrower cavities between the joists. He laid rough-sawn planks across the bottom of the joists to form the ceiling of the living space below, and rough-sawn planks across the top of the joists to form the floor of the attic space above. Between these two layers of planking, in the 12-inch cavity created by the depth of the joists, he would pack dried sphagnum moss. The moss came from a bog 3 miles east of the settlement, a 20-acre wetland at the base of a spruce-covered ridge where sphagnum grew in thick mats 2 feet deep. Aldous and Dana spent the better part of 2 weeks in late July and early August harvesting moss. They pulled it from the bog by hand, loaded it onto a wooden sledge that Aldous had built for the purpose, and hauled it back to the cabin site where they spread it on racks made of poles and rope to dry in the summer sun. Sphagnum moss holds up to 20 times its dry weight in water. This is one of the properties that makes it such an effective insulator when dry, because the same cellular structure that traps water also traps air, and trapped air is what provides the insulation. But it also means that freshly harvested moss is enormously heavy and must be thoroughly dried before it can be used. Aldous and Dana spread the moss no more than 4 inches deep on the drying racks and turned it every day, and after 10 days in the July sun, it was light, springy, and pale golden brown, and when Aldous squeezed a handful, it sprang back to its original shape immediately, which told him the cellular structure was intact and the insulating capacity was at its maximum. Dana's contribution to the engineering was critical, and it addressed a problem that Aldous had not considered because he had never encountered it in Latvia. Vermont had carpenter ants. Latvia did not, or rather, the species present in the vidzeme forests did not infest ceiling cavities the way the American species did. Dana discovered this when she found a colony of large black ants in a rotting spruce stump near the cabin site and asked Jeremiah Locke, their nearest neighbor, what they were. Locke told her they were carpenter ants and that they would eat through any wood in the cabin if given the chance, and that they were particularly fond of damp spaces above ceilings where condensation collected in the winter. Dana thought about this and realized that the moss ceiling cavity, if it ever became damp from condensation, would be an ideal habitat for carpenter ants. Warm, moist, enclosed, with wooden joists on all sides for them to tunnel through. She told Aldous, and Aldous said the moss would prevent condensation because it regulated moisture, which was true, but Dana was not satisfied. She went back to the bog and collected not just sphagnum moss, but also the wild mint and tansy that grew along the edges of the wetland, and she dried these herbs and mixed them through the moss at a ratio of approximately 1 part herb to 10 parts moss. Tansy and mint are natural insect repellents. The oils they contain are toxic to many insect species. And by distributing them evenly through the moss fill, Dana created a ceiling insulation that was not only thermally superior, but biologically hostile to the one pest that could have compromised it. This was not a technique from Latvia. This was Dinah's invention, born from observing a local problem and solving it with local materials, and it worked. In 7 years of occupation, the Ozzel's cabin never had a carpenter ant infestation, while 3 other cabins in the settlement did. When Aldous packed the moss into the ceiling cavity in August of 1885, Jeremiah Locke came by to watch. Locke was a third-generation Vermonter, a dairy farmer in his mid-50s with a weathered face and strong opinions about construction. And he looked at the moss and said it was the dirtiest thing he had ever seen anyone put inside a house. He said it would rot. He said it would attract mice. He said it would grow mold, and the mold would make the family sick. And he said all of this with the genuine concern of a neighbor who believed he was watching a newcomer make a serious mistake. Aldous listened politely and continued packing moss. He packed it 12 inches deep, compressing it by hand to approximately 8 inches once settled, which gave it a density of roughly 4 pounds per cubic foot, loose enough to maintain the air pockets that provided insulation, dense enough to stay in place and not shift or settle unevenly over time. He packed it in layers, working from the eaves toward the ridge, tamping each layer gently with a flat board before adding the next. And when the cavity was full, he nailed the top planks in place, and the moss was sealed between 2 layers of wood with no gaps, no air leaks, and no access points for rodents. Theron Katie, who ran the general store in Hardwick and sold firewood on the side at $4 a cord, expressed a different kind of skepticism. Katie did not care whether the moss rotted or attracted mice. Katie cared that if Aldous was right about the insulation, he would sell less firewood. Katie said nothing openly against the moss ceiling, but when other settlers asked him about it, he shook his head and said he had never seen anyone insulate a ceiling with swamp muck before, and he did not expect it to end well. Katie was not a malicious man. He was a practical one who understood that his firewood business depended on cold cabins, and a technique that made cabins warm was not in his economic interest. He sold firewood to 11 families in the valley and surrounding hills at an average of 4.5 cords per family per winter at $4 per cord. That was roughly $200 in firewood revenue per season, a significant portion of his income. And if moss insulation spread and cut consumption in half, he would lose $100 a year. These were the economics that made Theron Katie skeptical, and they were reasonable economics, even if his skepticism was not based on engineering. The first winter came in November of 1885, and it came hard. By the end of November, the temperature had dropped below zero 3 times, and by Christmas it had been below zero for 8 consecutive days, with a low of 22 below on the morning of December 28th. The settlement burned wood at a furious rate. Jeremiah Locke went through his first cord by December 10th. Rufus Tillotson, a farmer on the south end of the valley with a large but poorly built cabin, burned his first cord by December 5th and was buying his second from Theron Cady before Christmas. The average cabin in the settlement was burning approximately 1 cord every 3 weeks, which projected to roughly 6 cords over the full winter, more than the usual 5 because the cold had come early and hard. Aldous Ozols burned 1 cord of firewood between November 1st and January 15th. 1 cord in 10.5 weeks, against the settlement average of 3.5 cords in the same period. His cabin was warm. Not comfortable, if you sat close to the fire, warm. Warm. Dana could work at the table 10 feet from the hearth in her blouse without a shawl. The water bucket by the door did not freeze overnight. The inside of the windows showed condensation in the morning, but not frost, which meant the interior temperature was staying above 32 degrees, even in the hours before dawn when the fire had burned down to coals. Aldous measured the temperature difference with a mercury thermometer he had bought from a peddler in Hardwick for 65 cents. At floor level, 58 degrees with the fire burning normally. At ceiling level, 62 degrees, a 4-degree differential. In Jeremiah Locke's cabin, measured on the same day with the same thermometer, the floor temperature was 44 degrees and the ceiling temperature was 61 degrees, a 17-degree differential. The warm air in Locke's cabin was pooling at the ceiling and transferring its heat through the uninsulated planks. The warm air in the Ozols' cabin was pooling at the ceiling and staying there, because the 12 inches of moss above the planks was preventing the heat from escaping. If you want to know what happened when Aldous Ozols brought 3 generations of Latvian building knowledge to a Vermont hillside, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The numbers told the story more clearly than any argument. Aldous calculated his firewood consumption for the full winter of 1885 to 1886 at 2.25 cords. Jeremiah Locke burned 5.5. Rufus Tillotson burned 6 3/4 and spent $27 buying extra wood from Theron Cady. The settlement average was 5.2 cords per household. Aldous used less than half of that, and his cabin was warmer than any of theirs. The savings in labor alone were significant. Each cord of firewood represented approximately 4 days of cutting, splitting, and hauling. The difference of 3 cords was 12 days of winter labor that Aldous could spend on other work, repairing tools, building furniture, planning spring planting, while his neighbors were in the forest swinging axes in sub-zero cold. At $4 per cord, the 3 cords Aldous did not burn represented $12 in wood he did not need to buy, in a year when $12 was 2 weeks' wages for a hired farmhand. The moss had cost nothing. The labor to harvest and dry and pack it had been roughly 12 days of summer work for Aldous and Dana together. 12 days of pleasant summer work in exchange for 12 days of avoided winter work in bitter cold, plus $12 in saved firewood costs, plus a warm cabin instead of a cold one. The return on investment was extraordinary by any measure. But Jeremiah Locke was not convinced. Locke had watched Aldous's firewood pile shrink more slowly than anyone else's in the settlement, and he had felt the warmth inside the Ozols' cabin when he stopped by to borrow a saw in January, and he had seen the thermometer readings, and he still was not convinced. His objection was not to the performance of the moss ceiling. His objection was to the moss itself. He believed it would rot. He believed the moisture that collected in any attic space during winter, from condensation, from ice dam melt, from the simple physics of warm, moist air meeting cold surfaces, would saturate the moss and turn it into a breeding ground for mold and decay, and that within 2 or 3 years the ceiling joists would be soft and the roof would sag, and the Ozol's family would be dealing with a structural failure that would cost more to repair than all the firewood savings combined. This was a reasonable concern. It was based on genuine experience with organic materials in damp enclosed spaces. What Locke did not know was that sphagnum moss is naturally antimicrobial, the same chemical properties that allow sphagnum to preserve organic material in peat bogs for thousands of years. Its extreme acidity, with a pH between 3.0 and 4.5, and its production of sphagnum, a polysaccharide that binds nitrogen and starves bacteria of the nutrient they need to decompose organic matter, also prevent the moss from rotting when it gets damp. Sphagnum moss does not decay the way straw decays or sawdust decays. It resists decomposition at a chemical level. A ceiling packed with dried sphagnum moss will last 20 to 30 years before it compresses enough to need replenishing. And during that entire time it will not rot, will not grow mold, and will not lose its insulating properties, because the same chemistry that makes it an effective insulator also makes it resistant to the biological processes that destroy every other organic insulating material. Aldous knew this. He knew it the way he knew that spruce was stronger than pine, and that clay chinking needed lime to keep it from cracking, not from reading, but from observation, from growing up in a culture where these facts were common knowledge, passed from father to son over generations. He could not have explained the chemistry of sphagnum or the pH scale. He could explain that his grandfather's ceiling moss was still sound after 25 years, and that when his father replaced the moss in the family farmhouse ceiling in 1867, the old moss was dry and intact and showed no sign of decay despite having been in place since before Aldous was born. This was the evidence Aldous had, and it was better evidence than anything Jeremiah Locke had against it, because it was based on observed results over decades rather than assumptions about what might happen. The second winter, 1886 to 1887, was milder than the first. The temperature dropped below zero only 4 times between November and March, and total snowfall was below average. Firewood consumption across the settlement dropped accordingly. The average household burned approximately 4 cords instead of 5. Aldous burned 1 3/4. The savings were less dramatic in a mild winter, but they were still measurable, and more importantly, the moss showed no signs of the deterioration Locke had predicted. In the spring of 1886, after the first winter, Aldous had pulled up 2 of the top planks and inspected the moss. It was dry, intact, springy, and showed no mold, no discoloration, no insect damage, and no signs of compression beyond the initial settling from 12 inches to approximately 10. The mint and tansy that Dana had mixed through the moss still smelled faintly of their oils. Aldous replaced the planks and said nothing about it to anyone, because he did not feel the need to defend what was working. The third winter changed everything. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was the worst in Vermont in a generation. It began with a blizzard on November 14th that dropped 26 inches of snow in 36 hours and drove the temperature to 11 below zero before the storm had finished. By December 1st, the snowpack was already 3 feet deep in the valley, and the temperature had been below zero 9 times. By Christmas, the settlement was in crisis. Not a crisis of survival. No one was in danger of dying, but a crisis of resources. Firewood was running out faster than anyone had planned for. Jeremiah Locke had laid in 6 cords before winter, expecting that would see him through to April with a half cord to spare. By January 15th, he had burned 4 of them and had 2 left for 10 weeks of winter. Rufus Tillotson had laid in 5 cords and had burned 3.5 by the same date. The Ron Cotty's firewood supply was being purchased faster than he could replenish it, and by the 3rd week of January, he raised his price from $4 to $5.50 a cord, citing the difficulty of cutting and hauling in the deep snow, which was true, and the increased demand, which was also true. Pearl Cady, his wife, told him privately that raising prices on desperate neighbors in the worst winter anyone could remember was not a Christian act. Theron told her that freezing in the woods, cutting firewood for less than cost, was not good business. Both of them were right. On the night of January 23rd, 1888, the temperature in the valley dropped to 31 degrees below zero. This was not a record for Vermont, but it was close, and for the settlement in the hills above Hardwick, it was devastating. At 31 below, the thermal dynamics of an uninsulated cabin become brutal. The temperature differential between the inside of a cabin with a fire burning and the outside air can exceed 80 degrees, and the rate of heat transfer through every surface of the building, walls, floor, windows, and especially the ceiling, increases proportionally. A cabin that loses 40% of its heat through an uninsulated ceiling at 0 degrees loses 50% at 30 below because the temperature gradient is steeper and the rate of conduction is faster. The fire has to work harder to maintain the same interior temperature, which means more wood, which means the wood pile shrinks faster, which means the settler has to go out into 31 below weather to split and haul more wood, which means frostbite and exhaustion and the slow, grinding desperation of a winter that will not relent. The physics of this are worth understanding in detail because they explain why ceiling insulation matters more in extreme cold than in moderate cold. Thermal conduction through a material is proportional to the temperature difference across it. If the inside of a cabin ceiling is 60 degrees and the outside of the roof is 0 degrees, the temperature difference is 60 degrees, and heat flows through the ceiling at a rate determined by that 60-degree gradient. If the outside temperature drops to 30 below, the gradient doubles to 90 degrees, and the rate of heat flow through the same ceiling nearly doubles as well. The fireplace does not produce more heat just because the temperature outside has dropped. It produces the same heat it always does, determined by the amount and quality of wood being burned. But the ceiling is now losing heat almost twice as fast, which means the interior temperature drops, which means the settler adds more wood, which means the wood pile that was calculated to last until April now runs out in February. This is the arithmetic of extreme cold, and it is merciless, and it applies to every cabin in the settlement equally, except the one with 12 inches of sphagnum moss above the ceiling, where the rate of heat loss barely changes regardless of the outside temperature, because the moss provides enough insulation to reduce the conduction to a fraction of what an uninsulated ceiling allows. Edna Sprague, a widow who lived alone in a small cabin on the east side of the valley, ran out of firewood on January 25th. She had started the winter with 3 cords, which was usually enough for a cabin her size, and she had been careful, but the early cold had eaten through her supply faster than any previous winter. She walked to Theron Cady's store through waist-deep snow and asked to buy half a cord on credit. Katie, to his credit, gave her the wood without charge. But the incident made the entire settlement aware of how precarious their situation was. If Edna Sprague had run out by late January, others would run out by early March, and the winter showed no signs of breaking. Aldous Ozols had burned 1.5 cords by January 25th. He had started with 4 cords, expecting a normal winter, and he had 3.5 weeks of deep cold behind him, and 2.5 cords remaining. He would finish the winter with wood to spare. His cabin was warm, not warm by the standards of a modern heated house, but warm by the standards of the settlement, a steady 55 to 60 degrees during the day with a normal fire, dropping to no lower than 40 at night as the fire burned down. Donna had hung a second thermometer by the front door at eye level, and she checked it every morning. The lowest reading she recorded that winter was 38 degrees on the morning of January 24th, after the night of 31 below. In Jeremiah Locke's cabin, the same morning, the temperature at floor level was 26 degrees. The water bucket was frozen solid. Locke's family had slept fully clothed under every blanket they owned and still shivered through the night. The fire had been burning all night. The heat had risen to the ceiling, passed through the inch of planking, and escaped into the attic and out through the roof, and the fire could not produce heat fast enough to keep up with the loss. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because stories like this, the quiet engineering that kept families warm when everything else failed, deserve to be remembered. Locke came to see Aldous on January 26th. He did not come to argue. He came because his family was cold and his woodpile was shrinking, and he had felt the warmth inside the Ozols' cabin, and he needed to understand why. He stood in the main room of Aldous's cabin, and he could feel the difference. Not just the temperature, though that was obvious. It was at least 15 degrees warmer than his own cabin. The quality of the warmth was different. In Locke's cabin, the heat was concentrated near the fireplace and dropped off sharply with distance. In the Ozols' cabin, the warmth was distributed more evenly throughout the space. The air near the ceiling was warm, but not dramatically warmer than the air at waist level. The heat was being retained in the room rather than escaping upward, and this meant the entire volume of air in the cabin was warm, not just the column directly above the fire. "How much wood have you burned?" Locke asked. Aldous told him. 1.5 cords since November 1st. Locke had burned 4 cords in the same period. The difference was 2.5 cords, $10 in purchased wood, or 10 days of cutting labor, in a single winter. Locke looked up at the ceiling. "The moss," he said. It was not a question. Aldous nodded. 12 inches of dried sphagnum, Aldous said. Packed between the ceiling planks and the roof boards. The heat rises, hits the moss, and stays. He explained the principle simply, not the thermal conductivity numbers, which he did not know in scientific terms, but the practical reality. The moss traps air. Trapped air does not conduct heat well. 12 inches of trapped air between the warm ceiling and the cold roof acts as a barrier that keeps the heat in the room instead of letting it escape into the sky. Locke understood this immediately. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had grown up with uninsulated ceilings and had never questioned the practice because no one in his community had ever done it differently. "What about rot?" Locke asked. This was his original objection, and it was still on his mind. Aldous led him to the back of the cabin where a section of the upper planking was removable. Aldous had designed it this way deliberately, as an inspection hatch. He pulled the planks and showed Locke the moss. It was dry. It was springy. It smelled faintly of mint and earth. There was no mold, no discoloration, no softness in the joists, no sign of any deterioration. It looked exactly as it had when Aldous packed it 2.5 years earlier, minus an inch or two of compression. Locke put his hand into the moss and felt the warmth trapped in it, the heat rising from the room below, captured and held in the fibrous structure of thousands of individual sphagnum cells, each one a tiny pocket of still air that refused to let the warmth pass through. "I want to do this," Locke said. "Will you show me how?" Aldous showed him. Not in January. The bog was frozen under 3 feet of snow, and the moss could not be harvested until spring. But he explained the process in detail, sitting at the timber table in his warm cabin while Locke took notes on the back of an old feed receipt. And when the snow melted in April, Aldous took Locke to the bog and showed him how to harvest the moss. The technique was simple, but required care. You pulled the moss from the surface of the bog in sheets, taking only the top 6 to 8 inches and leaving the root structure intact so the moss would regrow within 2 to 3 years. You did not rip it out carelessly or dig into the lower layers. Sphagnum grows from the top. The living green layer is at the surface, and the dead compressed layers below it are what eventually become peat. If you take only the living layer and the first few inches of recently dead moss below it, the living base regenerates and the bog sustains itself indefinitely. The Latvians had been harvesting the same bogs for generations without depleting them because they understood this principle and followed it. Aldous showed Locke exactly how deep to pull and where to stop, and he showed him how to test whether the moss was ready by squeezing a handful and watching whether it sprang back. You loaded the sheets onto a sledge or a cart and hauled them to a drying site, a south-facing slope or a rack structure that allowed air circulation on all sides. The drying site mattered more than most people realized. Moss dried on the ground retained moisture from the earth beneath it and took twice as long to cure. Moss dried on elevated racks with air flowing above and below dried evenly and thoroughly in half the time. Aldous had built his drying racks from spruce poles and rope, chest high, tilted slightly toward the south to catch the maximum sun. You spread the moss no more than 4 inches deep and turned it daily, flipping the sheets so the bottom became the top. In good weather, with sun and wind, the moss dried in 7 to 10 days. In overcast or humid weather, it could take 2 weeks. You could tell it was ready when it was pale golden brown, lightweight, and sprang back immediately when squeezed. If it stayed compressed when you released it, it was still too wet. If it crumbled into powder when you squeezed it, it was too dry and had lost some of its cellular structure, though this was rare in Vermont's humid climate and only happened if the moss was left in direct sun for too long. The packing technique was equally important. You did not simply dump the dried moss into the ceiling cavity and close it up. You packed it in layers, each layer approximately 3 inches deep, tamping gently with a flat board after each layer to compress it just enough to eliminate large air gaps while preserving the smaller air pockets within the moss fibers that provided the actual insulation. Too loose, and the moss would settle unevenly over time, creating thin spots where heat could escape. Too tight, and you crush the cellular structure and reduce the insulating capacity. The right density was approximately 4 pounds per cubic foot, loose enough that you could push your hand into it with moderate pressure, dense enough that it held its shape when you removed your hand. Aldous could judge this by feel, the way a baker judges dough, But he taught Locke to use the hand test. Push your open hand straight down into the packed moss. If it sinks past the wrist with no resistance, it is too loose. Tamp more. If it stops at the fingers, it is too tight. Loosen and repack. If it stops at mid-palm, it is right. Dana showed Locke's wife, Edna, not the widow Edna Sprague, but Edna Locke, Jeremiah's wife, how to prepare the herb mixture. You harvested tansy and wild mint in midsummer when the oil content was highest. Dried them in bundles hung from a rafter for 2 to 3 weeks, then crumbled the dried leaves and stems and mixed them through the moss as you packed it. The ratio did not need to be precise. A double handful of crumbled herbs per bushel of moss was sufficient. The herbs would lose their potency over 3 to 4 years, but by then the moss ceiling had established itself as a dry, stable environment that carpenter ants were unlikely to invade regardless. Locke insulated his ceiling in the summer of 1888. The job took him and his eldest son 6 days, 2 days harvesting moss, 3 days drying, and 1 day packing. His ceiling joists were set on 24-inch centers and were only 6 inches deep, so his moss layer was 6 inches rather than Aldis's 12. But even 6 inches of sphagnum moss represented a dramatic improvement over bare planking. The following winter, 1888 to 1889, Locke burned 3.5 cords of firewood. His previous average had been 5.5. The savings of 2 cords represented $8 in wood and 8 days of cutting labor. His cabin was noticeably warmer. His wife, for the first time in 30 years of Vermont winters, did not need to wear a shawl indoors. Rufus Tillotson insulated his ceiling the following summer, 1889. His cabin was larger and more poorly built than either Aldis's or Locke's, with gaps in the wall chinking and a door that did not seat properly, so the improvement was less dramatic. He went from 6 3/4 cords to 4.5, but it was still the single most effective improvement he had ever made to the building, and it cost him nothing but labor. The reduction of 2 1/4 cords represented $9 in firewood savings and 9 days of cutting labor per winter. Over 5 years, that was $45 and 45 days. Numbers that Tillotson, a careful man with a ledger book, calculated and wrote down and showed to anyone who expressed doubt about putting swamp moss in their ceiling. Tillotson became, somewhat unexpectedly, the most vocal advocate for moss insulation in the settlement. He was not a man given to enthusiasm about construction techniques, but the firewood savings were so dramatic and so measurable that he could not stop talking about them. He told the story of his first insulated winter to anyone who would listen, and his telling always included the specific numbers: the cords saved, the dollars kept, the days not spent in the frozen woods with an axe. Tillotson's wife, who had complained every winter for a decade about the cold, told Dana Ozols that the moss ceiling had done more for her marriage than the parson's counseling. She was not entirely joking. The misery of a cold house wears on a marriage in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. And the relief of a warm house restores something that cold slowly destroys: the simple comfort of being at ease in your own home. By the winter of 1890 to 1891, 5 families in the settlement had insulated their ceilings with sphagnum moss. The results were consistent across all 5. Average firewood consumption dropped from 5 cords to approximately 3. Interior temperatures rose by 10 to 15 degrees. The cabins that had been cold for years, cold despite tight walls, despite good chimneys, despite adequate firewood supplies, were suddenly warm, and the reason was 12 inches of dried swamp moss above their heads. The moss did not rot. It did not grow mold. It did not attract mice, because mice prefer loose, granular, insulating materials like sawdust and straw that they can tunnel through easily, and packed sphagnum is too dense and too acidic for comfortable nesting. The only maintenance required was a biannual inspection to check for compression, and every 5 to 7 years, the addition of a few inches of fresh moss to replace what had settled. Theron Cady noticed the decline in his firewood business before anyone told him the reason. His sales for the winter of 1890 to 1891 were down 38% from his peak year of 1887 to 1888. 5 families that had previously bought 4 to 6 cords each were now buying 2 to 3. The math was obvious and the trend was clear. Cady was a pragmatic man. He walked to the Ozol's cabin on a Sunday afternoon in March of 1891, stood in the warm room, looked up at the ceiling, and asked Aldous to insulate his own house. Aldous did it for free. He and Dana helped Cady harvest and dry and pack the moss, and they did it cheerfully because Aldous had never held Cady's skepticism against him, and Dana understood that a warm store was good for the whole community. Cady's firewood sales continued to decline as more families adopted the technique. But his store business improved because families that spent less money on firewood had more money to spend on goods, and families that spent fewer days cutting firewood had more time to earn money to spend in his store. The economics shifted in his favor in ways he had not anticipated. By 1894, 11 of the 14 families in and around the settlement had moss-insulated ceilings. The 3 who did not were either too elderly to do the work themselves or too stubborn to try. The total firewood consumption of the settlement had dropped from an estimated 72 cords per year to approximately 40. 32 cords of firewood that did not need to be cut, split, hauled, and stacked. At $4 per cord, that was $128 in annual savings. At 4 days of labor per cord, that was 128 days of labor, more than 4 months of work that the settlement's families could redirect to farming, building, earning, or simply resting. The moss came from the same bog 3 miles east of the settlement, which showed no signs of depletion despite 7 years of harvesting, because sphagnum regenerates from its base when the top layer is removed, and the 20-acre bog produced far more moss than 14 families could use. Aldous Ozols never claimed credit for the technique. When people asked him about the moss ceiling, he said it was how they built houses in Latvia, and he had simply done the same thing here. He did not call it an invention or an innovation. He called it common sense. But it was common sense from a culture that had solved the problem of ceiling heat loss centuries before the American frontier existed. And it took a Latvian immigrant willing to look strange in the eyes of his neighbors, willing to carry cartloads of wet moss from a swamp and pack it above his ceiling while people shook their heads and called it filthy, to bring that knowledge to a valley in Vermont where 14 families were burning 72 cords of firewood a year because nobody had ever thought to insulate the one surface that mattered most. The moss ceiling was not Aldis's only contribution to the settlement. Over the years, he chinked 3 cabins with his lime and moss mixture, rebuilt Tillotson's sagging roof ridge, and taught Locke's son the basics of timber framing. Dana kept a garden that produced vegetables from May through October and preserved them in a root cellar that Aldous had dug in the Latvian style, with ventilation shafts and a gravel floor for drainage. They were quiet people who worked hard and helped their neighbors, and never forgot where they came from. or the knowledge they had carried across an ocean. In 1895, the state of Vermont sent a surveyor and agricultural assessor through the hill country above Hardwick to evaluate homestead improvements for tax assessment purposes. The assessor, a man named Hobart Pease, visited every homestead in the valley and recorded the condition of the buildings, the acreage under cultivation, and the improvements made since the original claim. Pease was a thorough man who had been assessing properties in northern Vermont for 12 years, and he had seen every kind of frontier construction: sod roofs, stone foundations, log walls chinked with everything from clay to cattle hair to old newspaper. But he had never seen a moss-insulated ceiling. When he reached the Ozol's cabin, he noticed immediately that the interior was warmer than any other structure he had inspected that week, despite the fire being banked low. He asked Aldous what was different about the construction, and Aldous showed him the inspection hatch and the moss. Pease spent 20 minutes examining the ceiling cavity, testing the moss with his hands, noting the depth, the density, the condition of the joists, and the absence of any mold or decay. He asked how long the moss had been in place. Aldous told him 10 years. Pease asked what maintenance had been required. Aldous told him he had added 2 inches of fresh moss in 1891, and that was all. Pease measured the interior temperature at 57 degrees, with the fire barely burning, and the outside temperature at 19 degrees, and he wrote in his report, in a margin note, that was preserved in the county records: ceiling insulated with dried bog moss, 10 to 12 inches depth, interior temperature notably higher than other structures inspected. Technique reported to reduce firewood consumption by approximately 50%. Recommend investigation for broader adoption. Pease visited 4 other cabins in the settlement that had moss-insulated ceilings and noted the same results in each one: higher interior temperatures, lower firewood consumption, no structural deterioration. He included a separate paragraph in his summary report, recommending that the State Agricultural Extension Service investigate sphagnum moss ceiling insulation as a potential improvement for farmhouses throughout northern Vermont, where winters were harsh and firewood costs were a significant burden on rural families. The recommendation was forwarded to the state capitol in Montpelier, where it was filed in the Agricultural Improvement section of the annual survey report, and it was never acted upon. No one investigated. No one followed up. The report sat in a cabinet in a government office, and sphagnum moss ceiling insulation remained a local practice known to 14 families in a valley above Hardwick and unknown to anyone else in the state or the country. Modern insulation materials, mineral wool, fiberglass, cellulose, eventually replaced every natural insulating material, including sphagnum moss, and the technique that had kept Latvian farmhouses warm for centuries and Vermont homesteads warm for a decade was forgotten entirely. The factories that produced fiberglass bats in the 20th century never knew they were replacing a material that performed nearly as well, lasted longer without degradation, regulated moisture naturally, resisted biological decay without chemical treatment, and could be harvested from any northern bog for free. The modern insulation industry solved the problem of ceiling heat loss with manufactured products, and in doing so, it erased the memory of a natural solution that had been working quietly in farmhouses across northern Europe, and in at least one valley in Vermont for longer than anyone could remember. But the principle has not changed. Heat still rises. Ceilings are still the weakest point in the thermal envelope of any building, and sphagnum moss, with its thermal conductivity of 0.04 watts per meter, Kelvin, its natural resistance to decay, its antimicrobial chemistry, and its cost of exactly $0 per cartload, is still one of the most effective natural insulating materials on Earth. It grows in bogs across the northern hemisphere. It can be harvested sustainably by taking only the top layer. It dries in the sun in 10 days. It lasts 20 to 30 years in a ceiling cavity without maintenance. And it was used by cultures across northern Europe for centuries before anyone invented fiberglass or spray foam or blowing cellulose through a hose. Aldous Ozols did not invent sphagnum moss insulation. His father did not invent it. His grandfather did not invent it. Nobody invented it. Somebody, a long time ago, in a cold place, noticed that the moss from the bog trapped warmth, and they put it above their ceiling, and the house was warmer, and they told their neighbor, and the neighbor did the same, and the knowledge passed from generation to generation for hundreds of years until a man named Aldous carried it in his memory across an ocean and packed it above his ceiling in a valley in Vermont, while his neighbors shook their heads and called it filthy. And then winter came, and his cabin was warm, and theirs were not. And one by one they asked him to show them how. No myths, no miracles, just moss, trapped air, and the patience of a bog.